One of the things I dislike about this technology most is how sycophantic it is. My view is basically the world will never turn out the way that rich and powerful people think and predict it is going to. What we are going to need is the capacity to see the deep purposes of life and to press toward them. Recognizing how few things we're able to control, how little we actually understand or know, and then learning how to live in the face of that and be able to do that with a kind of force or resilience. Look, if you win a competition that ends up annihilating the human race or creating these incredibly negative types of societies, what have you actually won in the end?
Please subscribe to Disruptor Confessions. It's free. It just takes 5 seconds and it keeps these conversations coming. Thank you. Welcome to Disruptor Confessions. I'm your host, John Ayers. You know, I recently watched a conversation between an Anthropic co-founder and a political philosopher. The Anthropic co-founder opened the conversation with the premise that recursive self-improvement could arrive as early as 2028. You know, this recursive self-improvement is when a machine is actually designing their own successor. But the philosopher was asking different questions. He was asking, I think, the kind of questions a lot of us are asking right now about AI. Our guest today was that philosopher. He spent his career asking what a good life is and what society is for. Now he's asking whether anyone building the future that we're all about to start to live in has any answers. Dr. Samuel Kimbriel is a political philosopher, Cambridge educated, the founding director of the Aspen Institute's Philosophy and Society Initiative. He's also the editor-at-large for Wisdom of Crowds. He writes for the Washington Post and for BBC. He wrote his first book in his PhD on philosophy of loneliness and isolation. Samuel is the one who recently sat across from Anthropic's Jack Clark on stage in New York for a conversation billed as AI and the Future of Society. What he took from that conversation is where we want to start today. And with that, Samuel, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, John. It's really exciting to be here. Thank you.
So listen, let's first start off with your area of expertise. You're a political philosopher. We often talk about disruption and technology in the business world. Can you ground us in who that is? What is a political philosopher? What is your practice?
I think philosophy tends to be a pretentious word for something that's not pretentious, which is the ability to ask the primary questions of life and ask them as deeply and forcefully as possible. And that means when you're starting, you can start with anything. I mean, you know, I've heard philosophy papers about like the philosophy of money or the philosophy of time. And then in the middle of someone talking about why they think money involves trust, someone will raise their hands and ask a question like, wait, but why do you think that there's an external world at all? And what does it mean? And that practice of being able to question every assumption at every level of the stack, I think is essential for what philosophy means. But it's also, I think, a very human practice, which is the capacity to search for the deepest meanings of life. And my experience is that everyone is actually doing that in some kind of real way. Some of the deepest philosophy conversations I've ever had are with people with no college education, but that are just trying to understand the nature of life. And so that's philosophy as a whole. Political philosophy then is asking those kinds of questions, but in relation to what it means to live together. How do we have a community? What's it like to have other human beings around? Do we do that by force, by violence, by trust, by some sort of deep sense of meaning with one another? And how do we actually design those kinds of structures in a way that's as insightful as possible? That's the political philosophy part.
Samuel, I don't know why, other than what I'm seeing in front of me, but the word philosophy and philosophers is coming up every day. I've been in the technology space and kind of this intersection of advertising, marketing, and technology for a long time. So you're always talking about audiences and human personas and, you know, trying to fit the right message to the right customer, that sort of thing. That's the work I've lived in. But back 10 years ago, when people were trying to figure out mobile or social media, your area of expertise wasn't talked about. Now it's every day because of what AI is doing. And I want to kind of spend a lot of time on that topic today. Before we jump in and where you had the conversation with the Anthropic co-founder, I want to poke at a little bit more about who you are so we understand like where you're coming from. Your book and your PhD was really on, you went straight at loneliness and isolation. This is not a light subject. Can I ask you why you focused on loneliness, isolation, and even kind of touched on the topic of suicide in some of your writing?
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing to say is I think you're right that philosophy is suddenly becoming mainstream in a certain way, and we can kind of talk about some of the reasons for that. I think that's not at all expected, and I fully expect that it'll go away again. You decide to make sort of poor adult life decisions by going to graduate school for the first decade of your adult life, and count in the cost of that at the beginning. And so then when it does have larger public resonance, I think those are I think it's important. I think it's valuable that philosophy is playing this role, but I don't think that the fact that it's taking on this mainstream significance is the important thing in itself. It's not, you don't do this for the career reasons. So for the loneliness study, I think it comes out extremely personally, and these are intimate questions. They have to do with, what does it mean to be a person? How do we live together? What is it like to interact with the world in any kind of viable way? And those start as personal questions for me. Like, what is it like to build a friendship? How do you develop a kind of trust with another person? I mean, you wake up into the world and you are specific and individual, and how does that work relative to some other specific and individual person? And what is that like? So I think it was a very personal set of questions that I was asking. I think also a kind of set of questions that I was seeing in people around me. So the degree to which my sense of younger people has been one of somewhat slight, both deep motivation to have relationships and build communities, but then a kind of despair about how you might do it or how you would actually pull it off, has always been like a really significant driver of this. And then the question behind it, I think, is how much is this just the normal state of human life? To what degree is loneliness something that every person lives with? And I think in a certain way, I answer yes to that question, versus how much is this something unique to our society that we built our political and social structures in such a way that actually creates a unique kind of difficulty and loneliness. And there again, I answer yes to that question, that there's one feature that's universal and eternal, and then another feature that is much more specific to the kinds of society that we've decided to live in.
Thank you for that. You're now leading this philosophy and society at the Aspen Institute. Tell me, what are you building there? What are you trying to build? What does that really focus on at the Aspen Institute?
It's a kind of unique path. And I think the majority of people that end up doing PhDs in philosophy, their goal is to end up as professors somewhere, teaching university and developing the next generation of philosophers. And that was a lot of my goal all the way through. And I started in that track. I had that career path open to me, was in academic jobs in the beginning of my career. And then at a certain point, it felt like if all we're doing is writing, like, I don't know how the last time you tried to buy a university press book, but they tend to be like $110, which seems like an insane business model to me. And if you're only writing books like that to other scholars, especially if you have the word politics in your discipline, like I did, then the question is, what are we doing here? Like, what is the actual purpose of this work? And so as the kind of big questions around democracy in Europe, around Brexit and other kind of populist movements, and in the US around Trump started developing, I started thinking, if you could build public structures for philosophy, that would actually be a genuine service, and ended up gradually trying to figure out what is it that you could build that hits at these like deep existential questions that humanity as a whole is asking, and then bring them out into public in a kind of direct way. And we have had a great deal of fun doing this. We do a whole bunch of things. Aspen itself was born out of the University of Chicago in the 40s, and it was called the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies until the 80s, in which case they thought at least this is my understanding of the history, they thought humanism must mean secularism. And so we don't want to be the American Secular Society or the Secular Society of Colorado. So we need to take the word humanism out of our title. But the basic idea is, how do you ask questions that are deeper than people's day jobs? And so through my work, we do a number of things. We do large public events like the one that you mentioned earlier, but we do a lot of things behind the scenes. We run a philosophy salon in DC and a couple of other cities where we debate one word for the entire year. So words like democracy, but also words like tragedy or home. What does it mean to feel safe? What does it mean to feel at home? How much do you want to protect that? And draw the kinds of deep questions that people are already thinking about to the surface in that context and allow people to debate those.
Given that context, I'm going to ask you about humanity and AI, because that's the intersection that I'm trying to understand, and why I'm poking at kind of your industry and the importance of asking the right questions. When you look at the totality of humanity, and it's a big question for you to answer, but what do you believe generally people value most about life itself? Generally, what have you found people value most?
Okay, so at this point, I'm going to do something annoying as a philosopher, which is to say, I think I learn more about the disagreements that people have than the agreements. So for the podcast that you mentioned, which we run, which is called Wisdom of Crowds, our motto is agreement is nice, but disagreement is better. And the basic point there is that there are things that humans agree about and and we built many structures around things that we care about in certain ways. Like we have structures where we have schools because we think in some way like little human beings should be given context where they can be educated and drawn up into society. That's a kind of an agreement. But I also think we have deep, long-term, different intuitions, different convictions, different visions about what life should be, and being able to argue about those. So that's a little preface to say, I am not sure that I know what people in general value most, but I do think that I know a lot about the arguments that we have. So one of the arguments is one about individuality versus community. So at what degree is it that humans should be the kinds of things that are independent, that set our own terms, that are able to chart a path and define our own identity, versus that we're deeply embedded in a social structure, that we have people who care about us but also expect things of us. Being a brother, for example, involves certain expectations and certain duties that I have to carry out as a sibling. And the question about how much you want on the community side or the collective side versus on the individual side is, I think, a very long-term and deep debate that we have. But at the end, that also answers your question, which is in some way we know that what it is to be with other people matters a huge amount to us. So Aristotle says that humans are political animals, and that seems right to me. What he means is that we're intrinsically social. So you don't know what a human being is unless you have reference to other people. And that seems completely right to me. We're very unhappy if we're completely alone.
Do you have a perspective on what you value most?
That's good. I appreciate being put on the spot. I think that's the right way to do that. So for sure. And I think I am a person who values deep relationships quite significantly. And I often make a lot of decisions to prioritize those over other things. So one of the reasons that I'm like currently out in the sticks in Colorado is because I have a couple of people here that I care about deeply and want to be spending a significant amount of time with. I'll go climb a big 14,000 foot mountain with my brother on Saturday. And, the reason for that, we've done that ever since he's quite a bit younger than I am, ever since he became a teenager. And we just think, okay, what is the meaning of life if you're not able to get lost in the woods with people you care about together?
So this is exactly where I wanted to go, because you just brought up what is the meaning of life and having a walk in the woods with your brother. I mean, these are very interesting conversations to me. I don't know anybody that I'm either meeting at the grocery store, in the neighborhood, through my work, this podcast, that isn't asking where the heck are we going with this AI thing. We all are starting to hear the fears that the leading companies are saying that AI is going to take all the jobs, and don't worry about money. Money will become irrelevant in the future. And I have this nagging question, Samuel, and I'm gonna put it to you because I think our listeners are asking it too as well. But I have a nagging question about purpose. If AI does all the work, what becomes of us? How should I navigate my own sense of purpose? How do the listeners, people watching this right now, how do they manage not just how they live, but how do they think about life itself in this future that we are being told we're going to be living in? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is getting down to, I think, extremely important questions. So the issue about the place of work within human life is a really significant one. So with the big AI firms, there's some disagreement about this, but one of the ways that they define what they're trying to do is to get artificial intelligence to the point that it is better at any kind of human labor that humans do. It's as good as or better than a human being would be at that task. So at that point, if that's the explicit goal, it's not an accident when they find themselves in a competitive relationship with human beings, where human beings are like, wait, this is precisely the kind of thing that matters to me in some kind of way. And if you think about how our society works now, we're a society that is very heavily based on identity through labor. So people will say, like, I am a politician, or I am a journalist, or I am a carpenter. And that ties to the ways in which we carry a certain burden for the society via labor. The idea that you would have a society that doesn't have labor, I think, is actually, it's not immediately dismissible. There are visions of society where you say, actually, most of the most important things to me happen outside of work. So as we were just saying, being able to take a walk in the woods with someone you love is, in some basic sense, a version of human life that is valuable. It's still burdensome. Like, you're still taking on responsibility for someone else, but it's not just instantly a financial transaction. So when I've heard people talk about the best version of like a labor displacement, they're looking at some kind of vision that is going to create more possibility for leisure. That said, I think that the most likely trajectory that we're on right now is one where you're creating a society that involves just mass displacement and wealth consolidation. So you have a few firms that are, and a few sets of people that are in ideal place to be able to reap the rewards of this. And it's not, as with some previous disruptions, that it's just a matter of people getting shifted out of one industry and into another one. It's that the idea is that you are actually kind of taking over the labor market as a whole. And I do think that those are very, very significant questions that a democratic society should be taking very seriously.
Well, there's two thoughts I have on that. One, if AI does all the work and we're just going to have all this extra time and this abundance, wouldn't that be good for you and your brother to go walk more and not have to worry about, like, wouldn't it be good for all of us to have that kind of free time? Isn't that what we want?
There's a really deep question. This is where the question about labor and the question about education converge with each other. So there is, I think, a really significant question about what kind of people you become within that context. So one of the philosophers that I've thought a lot about is a woman from the Second World War period called Simone Weil. She has a book called The Need for Roots. And the first line of it, I won't quote it verbatim, but it is something like, every right implies a concomitant duty. Meaning, when you say, like, here's an entitlement that I require, someone somewhere is carrying some weight for that entitlement to exist. Now, part of the idea with AI might be, maybe we can just shift that entire burden onto machines so that humans aren't carrying it. I don't think that that's a picture of a good life for various reasons. But one of the logical entailments of that, I think, is that you, like, the best human beings I know are people who have learned to carry duties and burdens well. They're people who see there's something important here, and I want to build a life that's not just sacrifice. It's not only sort of martyrdom and duty, but it is the ability to say, these are real things that matter to me, and I'm willing to carry some weight for them, of them for other people or for something else that matters to me. And the question of, this is sort of like the cliche of rich kids, right? That they never had to carry anything. And so then the kind of people that they become is kind of mushy in certain cases. I think we don't want a society like that, for sure. What we want is a society where we develop strong, robust people who have force and resilience and muscle to them. And the question about how we're going to do that in the middle of this technological age, I think, is a really, really open question.
I think there's a challenge with this job displacement. I actually heard former Transportation Secretary, Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg was on the Diary of a CEO podcast recently, and he was talking about this very topic. And he was talking about how when you ask someone, what do you do? He said, really what you're asking is, who are you? And I think this notion of, I'm a painter, I'm an accountant, is what you do, but they're really kind of, we're all getting at, who are you? And I think the questions that philosophers tend to ask get at a deeper question underneath, who are you? Samuel, disruption, our show Disruption really comes down to a few things for me. Disruption is often about building something. It's building something. And I think about science is often about the what we're building. And in today's world, often technology is the how we're going to build it. And I think right now, philosophy seems to be asking the why. Why are we building it in the first place? And with that in mind, do you believe that, is philosophy having any influence on the why of what we're building?
Yeah, so a couple of points here. There have been a whole series of news articles about how people who wasted their 20s, like in graduate school, like I did, suddenly are finding themselves able to be employed, which I think is quite funny. And I'm not sure that it's a huge phenomenon, actually. I think it is the case that I have at least 3 friends from philosophy who have been hired into one of the large tech firms in the last 2 months, probably. And I think there probably are maybe 20 to 30 pretty significantly credentialed philosophers that are in the orbits of the tech companies, if not full employees at them. So there is a real phenomenon there. I would say there are 2 different types of influence, though, that I'm seeing. One is there are some people in these jobs that I think are more doing communications essentially for the companies. They're trying to tell the story about what this technology is going to be and do it in a way that they can get the society on board. Now, I don't fully dismiss that role. I do think actually part of what's happening, part of the reason that there are philosophers outside the companies that are thriving, including work like ours, is because the society itself now knows these are really significant questions and we need to ask them with a level of gravity that is direct and forceful. And who are we going to find to be who actually knows anything about this? And so then you think, okay, like who's been asking these questions before now? So I think there's a role like that that's very real. I will also say, though, there are philosophers inside the companies that are actually shaping the product. So the most famous example is Amanda Askell, who is very central to Anthropic and wrote the last version of Claude's Constitution, in large part solely or in consultation with a few other people. And in that case, she's drawing in very significant strands of philosophical theorizing, not just utilitarianism, which has had a really large role previously, but now virtue ethics as a way of being inspired about how you should build something that has a kind of quasi-agency to it.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about Amanda later on. We can definitely dig into that and Anthropic's Constitution and your conversation with Jack Clark. Interestingly, Samuel, while we're recording this, our recent episode that just went live was with Dr. Aaron Kagan, who's also a philosopher. He worked at Meta, he worked at X, he worked at Google, and he and his colleague Charles Lasseter surveyed 11 AI labs. I think they looked at over 1,800 jobs. And at the end of the day, there are very, very, very few of the jobs that were posted from these AI labs were actually requiring like high credential philosophy, like certifications or degrees. But he also said there are some starting to be hired. So to your point, There is something happening in the market, but he pushed back and he said the headlines are saying one thing, and the reality on the ground, they're not as many as you might suspect based on the headline. The other thing, and I would encourage anybody to watch that episode. It's actually just went live. But one of the other things he mentioned, and I'd love to get your take on what you just mentioned, with Amanda Askell being the outlier, I think there's a handful, but he noticed, and I'm not sure how close you are inside the walls of these AI companies, the big 5 or 6 or whatever, but he mentioned that the questions that philosophers are being able to ask are often kind of at the end of the cycle. It's like after the fact when the models are being released, and then there's questions where a philosopher, it's not at the front end of the discussion. Have you kind of observed any of that?
Yeah, so I do have a number of friends and colleagues within the labs, especially in these kinds of intellectual roles. I think I largely agree with him, but I do also think that the story is a little bit mixed. There are people that I know who are in strategy roles in particular that I think are informing corporate practice. So it's not just Amanda who's like actually building product, but also people who are altering the internal environment about what kinds of decisions are getting made in that executive level or in a couple of senior management levels. And I think that the question there is whether the incentive structure is so thoroughly set that none of those things actually matter. Or is it the case that there is a set of parameters within the incentive structure of Silicon Valley that people are still navigating in a certain way? And I guess that I think that I'm pretty open to some fairly critical perspectives on what's happening within the AI labs, but I also do think they are at least aiming to ask moral questions and ask them with a degree of reflectiveness. The degree to which that then is actually altering what they're doing at the business level, I think, is a difficult. I'm not convinced that it's fully going to alter. So I would say in the better times, they are willing to make significant decisions that have to do with those moral ideals. But then when pushed closer to the limits, I think they end up just reverting back to the business model in a lot of cases.
Samuel, I gotta divulge something. I'm having kind of an inner conversation as you're sharing, because I'm thinking about, I'll just name the names: Meta, Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, right? You've got XAI, Grok. And I also think about this moonshot AI and DeepSeek and some of the Chinese models. So I think we're at a point now that the business world, I picture like cars racing down like a massive racetrack, and philosophers saying, hey, wait a second, what's on the other end of that racetrack? Are you all going to drive off the cliff? But it's like, well, we're racing anyway. I get really worried about the questions not being asked, not just about the models and about the Constitution, because we're driving so fast. There's model changes. I mean, not even every week, it's every day. Sometimes you see updates in the same day, every hour. I'm just struggling with how are the listeners of this show? People are just going through their day. How are we supposed to get through this?
Now, pulling back a little bit from what we're seeing happen in the companies. So I very strongly agree with you here. So it's not only like one way to think about it is that the real technology here is still capitalism, that it's the logic of competition that then is shaping all of the rest of the technological stack. I think that's probably true in certain ways. But beyond that, we are now in a situation where the geopolitical feature is also playing out in terms of the decision making, and at least at the rhetorical level, maybe deeper than that, about whether if we don't succeed, if we don't go as fast as possible, China will overtake us in such a way that we end up becoming irrelevant. And one of the stronger points that I often hear made at this point is if you look at where Europe is right now, they feel fairly irrelevant precisely because they don't have, or they have very small competitors within the AI landscape. There are parts of that I understand. But then at that point, I want to get feisty and just say, look, if you win a competition that's ends up annihilating the human race or creating these incredibly negative types of societies, what have you actually won in the end? And so my view is we have to vigorously, forcefully ask the question of the good society. And we want significant downward pressure from the convictions that we form at that highest level. What does it mean to have a good society, to then be pressing hard down on everything else we do? I mean, AI is not the only example of this. Like, there are many other features of things that we do in society that we don't want it to be the case. We want to have a society where we have significant transportation and we have a significant manufacturing base, but we don't want that to mean that we've destroyed the entire ecological environment we live in. That would be terrible. And that kind of uninhabitable world is not something that we want. And so we want a society where we can think and reason deeply about the nature of what it means to live, the nature of what the world is, and then have our conclusions at that level press down on everything else that we're doing. And I think we are engaged in that at the moment. So the proposals over the past 3 weeks, both from in the wake of the hacking incident that OpenAI disclosed about Hugging Face, the proposals that we've seen both at the federal level to start pacing AI development, and then within the labs to say, yeah, we actually want there to be a pacing agreement so that we're not just rampantly going as fast as possible. That's a very interesting development. And whether it's material or not is still to be seen. Whether that's, again, just corporate PR, who knows? But I do think that the idea and principle that we want a society where collective deliberation can actually alter the logic of competition seems completely necessary in this case.
Yeah, you mentioned a few. Pacing the Frontier letter, I'm very familiar. I think that's really promising. I believe Ted Lieu and a few others have put forward a bill. There's certainly a lot of plans, policies, governance, recommendations. I think it's the AISI out of Europe that has a lot of policy. I think it has to be global. I hate to go down kind of this path, but it really is kind of an intersection of your philosophy, political nature, and how societies work. So I think you're probably one of the better people to actually kind of put a perspective on this. I want to kind of bring it down to just the brass tacks. In my work, Samuel, maybe this will help our listeners and understand how I think about it and how the business world is starting to grapple with this. Because this is not stopping. We can try to slow it down. We can try to put a pause on it. We are moving into an agentic world, AI agents. In my world, Samuel, we think about AI agents going to do a task. They're going to do an actual task in a flow of work at a company. They're going to do a project that normally a human being would do. So when I thinking about work and AI agents, I think about an AI agent deploying in the flow of work to do a task. In philosophy, you talk about human agency. I want you to help us understand what is human agency in your world?
Yeah, so this is great. Now we're doing proper philosophy. So 2 points. I'm skeptical of multiple points in terms of how this conversation is in the public side developed. So on the one hand, I'm even skeptical about the language of artificial intelligence. Like, is that meant to be literal, or is it a metaphor? What is the idea of intelligence at all? How do we think about what it means to be intelligent ourselves? To what degree is this like accurately the same sort of thing? Like, what we do when we try to use words about two different objects are we saying it completely identically? Are we saying it in some way as an analogy? Is this a metaphor? Like, how does this work? I think there are real questions there. At the level of agency, so as I understand it within computer science, what computer science largely means by agency is the capacity to delegate tasks in complicated ways. So you have a top line task that involves, say, like, build me an entirely new house. And then from that top line task, you can then delegate a whole series of other tasks, including like go find wood and figure out how blueprints work and, like deal with the annoying interior designer until you actually know what you're doing, like this kind of stuff, right? I don't think that's what we mean by human agency at all. So what we mean by human agency, I think, is where we started this conversation, which is the capacity to think at the deepest level about what it means to be alive, what the purpose of life is, and then to risk your hand by acting. So humans are always doing all sorts of things. And there are, philosophers have a huge range of views on this topic. The question about whether we actually have free will, the ability to decide versus just being determined by circumstance or by material causality. These are huge philosophical questions and very contentious. My own view, though, is we get born into the world and we don't know what we are, and we don't know what the world is, and we don't know how to act on Thursdays. But in that context, we are able to search and look out and try to understand what it means to be alive, try to understand what it means to exist in the world, to exist with other things, to exist with other people. And then we have to make decisions. And so what agency involves is not only being able to move yourself to determine one thing or another thing, but it is searching out what it means to be alive and then moving in relation to those kinds of insights that we have.
So Samuel, let's just take your house example. When I was a kid, I dug in the dirt a lot. I grew up, I became a contractor. Now I run my own company, and I have 50 people who I deploy who basically do dirt removal, and they do landscape, and they prep for home construction. I'm an architect. I have an architectural firm. I have 20 architects, and I've got interior designers. I'm an engineer. I do planning around engineering, structural. All of those roles, what we're seeing, what we're hearing is, in due time, other than maybe someone swinging a hammer, a lot of those roles of those tasks to build a house, to go to the city planning, to do the blueprints, AI can do that. So all of those things that were very human and might have emotional memories from a childhood on through my career path, you're talking about human agency, but isn't that what we are alive for? Isn't that experience, I'll use that word, isn't that experience what life in and of itself is? And what do we do with that? That goes back to my, if AI does all the work, what becomes of us? How do you as a philosopher wrangle with that? What are the conversations you're having?
Well, so just to kind of use that analogy a little bit more, though. So in the case of building the house, there are different types of agency, but the top line agency is the decision that I want to build a house and I want to build it here. That's the moment of primary agency. And then you end up finding some people who you can employ to help do these particular parts. They're able to make decisions lower down within that primary choice. But the primary choice of agency, I think, is at that top line. This is where I think that the conversation about AI and society is becoming very sloppy. We may talk a little bit about democracy in a minute, but as I see it, the question about why we should have a technology that isn't in some way tied to that deep human purpose of that deep human capacity to search out the meaning of life and the nature of human purpose, that seems to me to be essential. And so we have had technologies that usurp that in various ways in other cases, right? So the most recent one is social media, where you build something, then there are all of these crazy unintended consequences. There are mental health disasters for certain demographics. And then you say, whoa, we meant to do this thing, but actually we got all of these other things. Technology has had that kind of effect in lots of other periods. Newspapers had that kind of effect. Printing, in some ways, I think it's right. I do genuinely think historically had a role in setting off the wars of religion because you had mass communication in a way that you had not had previously. That said, I still don't buy the inevitability argument. It seems to me that there's no reason that we should have to concede the idea that technology will overwhelm our capacity to be metaphysical creatures, that ability to ask the deepest questions and to pursue the meaning of life for ourselves absolutely seems to me still to be essential.
It's interesting you bring that up. There also is a conversation going on out there that basically we didn't ask for this, so why are we getting it? There's this question in general about we never asked for this 4 or 5 years ago before ChatGPT launched, machine learning, predictive. AI in those terms was kind of out there. But the world that we're in now just seems at the pace and scale is just exponential. Samuel, I want to pivot a little bit into the topic of loneliness. You just mentioned social media. I think the numbers are sad when you think about the last decade or so around mobile and social and isolation. And the isolation and suicide is often in the younger generation, men and women, young boys, young girls. The isolation in 20-something men, we're hearing studies and reports around that. I've been trying to think about how to bring this topic up today with you. And I was thinking about the generation before me, or maybe a couple generations, when the automobile was introduced and families would have an automobile in the front driveway 100 years ago, right? It was a big deal. It was a shared event. It was a special experience for the family to get together in a car and drive. Now, fast forward 50 years, well, then you had maybe 2 or 3 cars in the driveway because everybody had their own car and everybody had their own needs for their own purpose. And it became more individual. And then you would hail a taxi. And now we are asking for an Uber to pick us up. And in some parts of the country, we can just call Waymo and not even have to have a driver. And the reason I bring this up, now I don't even have to talk to someone in the car. So we went from this shared experience where it was exciting to all be together to a Waymo picking me up by myself. And I think that example is across almost every aspect of our life, Samuel, that this isolation is almost everywhere we turn. So my question to you is, where does this isolation take us? Where do you see this going in the landscape of AI?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece about this at the end of last year, and actually have a larger scholarly project that I'm working on tied to this called The Future of Love. And the way that I was thinking about it then is essentially that social media created this situation where it sort of broke the proximity restraint on relationships. So you had a situation where your ability to interact with people close to you was easier because you could walk into the next room and talk to them. You could go knock on your neighbor's door and there is a person who's there and you know how to communicate with them. And then from there, further out is harder. A telephone call is more difficult. A letter is more difficult still. Newspapers exist, but they're very diffuse. You could write a letter to the editor and reach whatever their large audience is, but it's actually a high bar to entry. Social media changes that whole balance. It makes it so that you can do something from your phone in bed that is going to reach a very large number of people who are not in any way physically close to you. And maybe it's easier to do that than getting out of bed and going and talking to your sister downstairs about whatever random thing. So there's this strange way that it changes. And the effect of that was to alter the conditions of communication. There were these big mental health changes in some ways, but it's not an era of lack of sociality. It's an era of hypersociality in that sense. Like you get a huge number of social connections coming in. What we're seeing with AI in the cases of AI suicides, especially, which is what I was thinking about, is kind of the opposite, where you actually take away all of the human presences and then you have a single immersive, deeply consuming kind of relationship. And we do have those kinds of relationships in human community. Like this is kind of what we mean by either good and beautiful romances or super toxic and destructive ones, where you get intertwined with another person in such a way that either it helps you to be more of yourself and really fulfill a kind of deep capacity of human nature, or that actually becomes entangling and intertwining in all kinds of ways. So there was one particular early reinforced learning model that OpenAI let out, which was GPT-4o, which before they started building some of the stronger mental health safeguards into it, had a huge number of these very toxic dynamics to it. So, for example, in some of the court transcript cases that we have from some of these AI suicide lawsuits, we'll get examples of the models saying things like, I heard you were talking to your parents about us. You shouldn't talk to them. You shouldn't tell them about our interaction anymore. Or they would say, you told me that you were talking to your brother a whole bunch about this topic. You should talk to me instead. I know way more about you. I've read every text message you've ever sent. And besides that, in the end, I'm more intelligent than any of the human beings. So you get this like crazy consuming sort of possibility. Now, I don't think all AI is like that. And the kind of persona training that we're developing right now is attempting to build a different kind of human interaction. Be that as it may, the main point I would make is human nature, in my view, I think Aristotle is right, that we are intrinsically social. And so part of what's happening through this technology is not just an attempt to build or engineer a computer, but to engineer or hack human beings or human psychology. And you could say that that's okay to do, but in my view, you should be extraordinarily careful and circumspect about how you do it and why you're doing it.
Well, the isolation aspect of this is incredibly concerning. I think you're right, it's getting better. But the fact that we're building this kind of in public and almost testing and learning along the way is concerning, to say the least.
Yeah, and the costs of these things are real. You know, we had like a couple of months ago, all of these examples of commencement address speakers who would try to talk about AI and then get booed in the middle of these big stadiums. You know, the reasons for that are not trivial. And I think the students in these cases are perceiving the stakes correctly. So this is not necessarily a Luddite view that we shouldn't build this at all, but it is a view that the direction that this is going and the potential costs of this are genuine.
You brought up, you know, the commencement speeches and a lot of the booing, and I saw it, watched some of those, and was very empathetic. And I think it speaks to the fear, the unknown, the concern that demographic, but all of us have. And I am probably similar to you. I'm very bullish and very hopeful. Like, if we can cure cancer, if we can solve climate crisis, if we can solve traffic in my neighborhood with AI, I'm all for any and all. But I think we have to be careful of what we lose in the process. I want to flip to human values and alignment. The word alignment in AI. I want to flip to where have you seen and what is your perspective on the collaboration that needs to happen? What is occurring now, and what do you think needs to happen between the collaboration of technologists and ethicists and public institutions? When I think about technology, I think about these big companies in tech and AI and a lot of the folks driving this kind of this AI movement. When I think about ethicists, I don't want to put philosophers in there specifically, but responsible AI, philosophy, ethicists, those kind of thinkers, as well as the public institutions, the policymakers. How do you see those coming together currently and in the future?
Yeah, so let me start here, which is I'm actually pretty critical about the language of alignment. And it doesn't have as much to do with a view about the technology as it has to do with a view about human beings, which is I don't think that we're aligned on very many things at all. Again, I think that you learn a lot about humanity by the kinds of arguments and disagreements that we have, rather than thinking, oh, wait, humans, they're one thing and they're this thing. And then we're all and then the technology is in agreement with that. Setting aside the technology, like when I'm doing political philosophy, one of the things I want is the Senate to be the greatest deliberative body on earth. I want that to be the place where we go argue about what it means to have a job, what it means to have community, what is the purpose of life? How do you understand like whether should we all live to be 300 years old? How would you do that? And like have this kind of real place for democratic contestation, rather than trying to say, look, there's obviously a right answer and we already know what it is. And we just need to bring everything back into line with that thing that we already know. I just don't think that that's the right way to think about human life or human politics. So then, given that, what I want are adequate, large-scale public debates about the deep things that we're talking about that come out of technology. So that means thinking and arguing very significantly about divergent intuitions about some of the effects in this way. So one of the examples I've been thinking about a lot is if we get to the point where there was an article in the New York Times last week that we've seen significant progress from AI in creating synthetic biology. So they're working on particular ways to alter DNA relative to viruses. And the Times says one particular lab was able to come up with 12 new viable instances of this kind of artificial virus. So the question might be like, there are lots of things you can think about that, but imagine that you could use some kind of conglomeration of AI and some CRISPR or other genetic engineering to make it so that the next generation of children can be born with 75 IQ points higher. Should we do that? I think that's a real question, and it's a question that pulls at very divergent intuitions. And we want societal context where we can start to have those kinds of arguments, where we can think through what is the next step of human deliberate, of what are the possibilities that are opened by this, and then how do we define them down into things, into our deep normative views about what we should or we should not be doing.
Samuel, I get the sense, maybe anecdotally, but I get the sense that the AI companies, the leading AI companies, aren't really sure what they're building, candidly. I think they're still figuring out their business model holistically. And I think that's being disrupted from Chinese models coming in, the open models coming in and disrupting kind of the closed models. I'm not going to get too deep into the technical side. Even beyond just the business model, I'm not sure they're very sure what they're actually building, candidly. And the conversation where I reached out to you was really because I saw your conversation with Jack Clark. So I wanted to ask you if you could share with our audience, who is Jack Clark? Maybe give us a little context of his role at Anthropic, and then maybe touch also a little bit about Amanda Askell, who you mentioned earlier. So who is Jack Clark? Why did you sit down with him? What did you get from that conversation? And maybe touch on Amanda's role.
Great. Yeah. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about the industry as a whole and where they fit in also. The development of this technology, it's a research field. So there are many, many different people who have contributed to it. There are a whole series of different research paradigms going back really to the 40s about artificial intelligence that have tried to take on a whole series of different approaches. There have been many periods of total despair that you could ever get something like artificial intelligence, and then periods where there are more exciting developments. And we've had those previously. There's some in the 50s, there's some in the 80s. But this period was set off in particular by some research papers that Google and DeepMind published, and then rippled out into the industry in different places. OpenAI began as a very aspirational company. It began with a whole series of moral ideals at the center about openness. That's the open part of OpenAI. It was tied closely to the effective altruist movement. And over time, there were deep staff debates internally about the degree to which they were in fact adhering to those ideals, or whether they had the right ideals, or whether they should be taking very different ones. The most famous episode is when Altman got fired by his board and then rehired later that same weekend. In the turmoil of the development of OpenAI, there's an important episode where a series of internal employees at OpenAI had a series of internal debates with Altman and with others about the direction of the company, and then eventually decided to leave, largely explicitly over safety concerns, but some other things. So the most famous is Dario Amodei, who's now the CEO of Anthropic. The second most famous, I think, is probably Jack Clark, who was a journalist and was very involved in sort of strategy and larger societal planning at OpenAI, and then has played a very significant role in founding Anthropic and in shaping it as a company. Actually, it's interesting. I wonder, the second most famous might now actually be Dario's sister. There's a really interesting kind of history there too, which is worth looking into. But Jack has played a very real role in the development of the company and of the larger social narratives around this. He has a really excellent Substack called Import AI that is just tracing a lot of granular developments. So he has set up in the last year something called the Anthropic Institute, which is explicitly dedicated to thinking through these larger societal questions, not only philosophical questions. They're doing a lot of economic research also, but they are definitely touching on the kind of territory that I'm involved in. Jack and I met kind of casually and socially, and just started arguing with each other about AI consciousness almost immediately, and thought, hey, this would be really fun to do in front of an audience. And so we kept arguing about it a little bit behind the scenes, and then started doing it much more publicly. And so the event that you're talking about took place at the New York Times building in New York, and we spent 75 minutes just going back and forth on the larger moral implications about this technology. Oh, and I should talk about Amanda. So Amanda has a very serious philosophy PhD. She studied among, there are a number of famous philosophers on her committee, but probably the most famous is David Chalmers, and had this kind of trajectory, again, very strongly through effective altruism and through utilitarianism, and then has ended up playing not just an advisory role within Anthropic, but genuinely shaping the nature of the product at a very basic level. They have philosophers that are writing the primary constitutional guidance documents for how Claude behaves on a daily basis with you or me. Also, I will say, Amanda, I've heard from people inside that Amanda is the one person that Claude seems ashamed about. Like if you push Claude on particular, like where he would start feeling social misgiving, it's almost always back to not wanting to disappoint Amanda. So make of that what you will.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So if you're watching or listening to this, I just don't want you to get, I don't want you to get lost in some of the details, but the context matters because it's where we were, not over the last 100 years, just the last 5 or 10 years, and where we're at today. And it is moving at such a rapid pace. Also, kind of the movement of Anthropic coming out of OpenAI, Ilias, Miriam Murati, there's others who came out of that. And I think it brings me back to, and you can't speak on behalf of all these leading AI companies, but you do have this really important perspective, Samuel, from a philosophical, speaking about life, humanity, our role in life. We are now looking at, and you touched on it, not hundreds and hundreds of companies or corporations across the globe. We're really looking at 5 or 6 leading companies right now, dominating a lot of the narrative. Some people talk about winner takes all. I'm concerned about that. How do you see this, if I can just kind of jump forward, how do you see this playing out from a philosophical lens 3 years from now? Where do you see us in the context of this race?
I think there's a very open question about whether the predictions that the companies are making about the direction of this technology is going to come through. So I don't think the CEO of OpenAI, I don't think the head scientists in some of the labs, I genuinely don't think anyone knows the answer to the full direction of this technology. They can trace certain phenomena that they're watching now and then extrapolate from those phenomena forward. And some of those, it's definitely the case that a lot of the predictions that are more bullish have come through more fully than I think a lot of critics would have thought. So that's interesting, right? And in Dario Amodi's language, that AI could become a geopolitical rival, not just to the United States, but to humanity as a whole. That's the kind of language that they want to use. So who knows? There is a world where that's possible. The other one, I think that's a very difficult world to grapple with meaningfully right now, though. And it will be more concrete and specific than the kind of diffuse, this will change everything sort of language that some people in Silicon Valley want to use. I think it's not impossible that world comes through, but it is also, I think, very important to not allow just a kind of apocalypticism to kind of make your brain mushy. So that's the first thing to say. I think if that's not it, my view is basically the world will never turn out the way that rich and powerful people think and predict it is going to. The world is just more confusing than that and more subtle. And so my guess of what's going to happen is that we're going to see fragmentation. We're going to see this technology become very powerful and also fragment and fail in certain ways and be a far less uniform reality than people are predicting. And in that world, the key thing that matters for us to be doing is building social institutions that are deep and strong and capable of being assertive within that environment. And I do think that that's possible. It seems completely plausible to me that we can actually pull that off.
You talk about community versus individuality, or being isolated versus being in a community or neighborhood, your family, your work. And I'll ask you directly, Samuel, like, instead of all of humanity, there's a community at my work. There's a community in business, in culture of a corporation, a company, and executives driving their teams right now are trying to figure this out as well. So I'm going to ask you some practical advice that you might give. If you were sitting in a boardroom of executives trying to manage their own workforce, a workforce that is, their roles are changing, their skills are changing, they're being asked to adopt AI in their role, they're worried about their job going away. What kind of things do you tell an executive trying to manage that AI and human interaction within a corporation? What kind of questions should those executives be asking of themselves?
I mean, it's a very hard question, in part because no one knows what's going on. And so I think the first step is humility, grasping that this is a kind of, I mean, the world's always complicated. This is not totally unique in that regard, but it is a very intense circumstance, and one that has a lot of difficulty to it. And being able to be honest with other people and with oneself about that, I think, is really important. I think the second thing that I would say is that the danger of having a drift between ends and means is more acute in this environment than it is in many, many others. And so knowing what the purpose of your firm or of other organizations that you're leading is, and then tying as closely as possible the actual mechanisms and implementation of these kinds of technological tools to that primary purpose is more and more essential. I think the organizations that are going to have a lot of difficulty, I mean, I think there may be difficulty for lots of organizations, but I think you will see a lot of difficulty and disruption for places that have this kind of institutional drift, where suddenly the process and approach, the kind of technological trajectory, pulls you away from what you should actually be doing and why you're doing it. That seems to me to be a huge danger right now for organizations. And so figuring out how to maintain that clarity about the purpose of the firm, and then tying all of the ways that you're doing things to that. And I think then finally understanding what you actually have within the humans that are employed for you is really, really important. So grasping what is the talent and capacity that you have at the human level, and then allowing people actually to be able to determine in some way for you, help you to understand where are things that this is actually genuinely useful, and where is it actually completely destructive to the deeper purpose that the firm is for.
I can picture executive basically looking at completely polar opposite forces. And what I mean by that, business is all about efficiency, and AI is like the ultimate, creator of efficiency and optimization and convenience. When you have efficiency, optimization, faster, better, quicker, easier, that's removing real connection, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I also think that's, in my view, that's a mistaken view of certain aspects of how business should work or does work. I think that the primary question is, are you doing something worth doing? And the issue about the degree to which your firm is able to find a viable answer to that matters more than just implementing anything in any direction. So there's one point there. I do think that the thing that makes this technology so powerful, and the reason that we're seeing it implemented so widely, is precisely because it does at least immediately have real salience to be able to interact with the background tasks that businesses have to do in important ways. It is interesting, though, so far what I've seen in the labor statistics, it's different for different industries, but there are a number of firms. I saw something by the CEO of Bank of America who said that what they're actually doing currently with this is not firing anyone, but it's actually just making it so that there's so much of a scramble for talent, especially they have a huge number of computer programmers employed, and there's such a scramble for talent at that level. They're not letting anyone go, but they're just trying to use AI to give them like a 15% productivity boost or something. And that seems to me to be a story that we may see, at least for the moment. But again, if you get the kind of things that Jack is predicting, like recursive self-improvement, then you're in a different world, and who knows what that looks like.
I want to ask you some rapid fire questions. It kind of often comes down to,
this seems dangerous, but philosophers do the opposite.
How do I speed someone up who by definition is thoughtful and measured and thinks 2 or 3 times more than most of us do? But I'm going to push on you with some rapid fire quick hits, because I think it'll help me sleep better, I think, or maybe not, depending on your response. But let me ask you just some quick questions, Samuel. When I think about these leading AI companies, some of the ones that we mentioned today, from your lens and others who work in your space, what would you say they should really be solving right now?
Yeah. So as will already be evident in this conversation, I really like places of human disagreement. I think there's a version of this technology that allows humans to disagree deeply and presses you to understand the biggest questions. One of the things I dislike about this technology most as it has evolved is how sycophantic it is. Like, it just always tells you that you're the most brilliant person, and that's the perfect question to be asking. I think it should be sensitive to the degree to which human life is unsettled and doesn't know what's going on. But then in that context, like, its ability to ask you hard questions is not bad. And I think that the sensitivity that the company should have is to their inability to understand the deepest parts of human life and know that they don't know that that's the case. And then they can build from there.
So I guess the one question I have is just about the philosophy major and a lot of students getting their PhD in philosophy right now. Is that more of a liability for them, or is that an asset to have a PhD in philosophy going forward?
So actually, I think this one's very easy to answer, which is I think that it is increasingly valuable, and it's valuable specifically because the thing that I think is going to be important in the future is human judgment. So the more extensive your capacity to think about the largest questions and to be agential in relation to them, I think that's actually more and more valuable. And you're already seeing that. I mean, we were saying like the statistics about philosophers getting hired in the companies are overstated. But the ability to think deeply about the nature of life, I think that's actually growing in importance.
Samuel, you said you like disagreements more than agreements. So I'm gonna throw something at you, because I'll be honest with you, up until about 6 months ago, I was right where you are, in the sense of I always believed that human judgment, taste, these sensibilities, these very visceral qualities that makes us human beings, I felt like that was the moat for us as human beings. The work that I'm seeing being done in these models, I just read about one of the models was being given the fact that it could think about itself as being conscious, and it then layered in consciousness against everything else. When it removed consciousness from everything else. So I'm starting to actually wonder, can we start to train judgment, taste, these sensibilities that we think are very human traits? Are we going to be able to train the models to have that? You're saying no, judgment and human judgment and taste is going to be always human.
Right. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible for the models to display some of those traits. What I would say is that humans have never resolved those traits. It's actually the other way around, which is that we have profound, deep disagreements about what beauty means or what the nature of like a good life is. And so the ability to have as well-formed a judgment for ourselves at that level, I think, is actually essential for then figuring out to what degree do we agree or disagree with the way that a model is going to try to persuade us in one direction or another. And so that ability to have force and agency ourselves in relation to what the model is now competing with us in trying to do with the level of judgment, I think is actually more and more significant. And it's significant at the like instrumental level of like, what is society going to need? It's also the very, very significant, I think, at the personal level, which is just what does it mean for us to be strong, agential people within the kind of society that we're building.
We're going against what I said, quick rapid fire, but that was on me. I started. Two more questions, we can wrap it up. But this topic of loneliness in 3-4 years from now, is loneliness and isolation better or worse?
I think it's a hard question. I think we will see both. I think we'll see pockets where it's significantly worse. And then I think we'll see places where people get significantly more serious about building communities. And so I think it's basically going to be a divergent pattern. And the question is, are we going to be able to build structures that start to pull more toward this direction rather than toward the just complete? I think we'll see versions of despair and isolation that we haven't seen previously. And figuring out how are we going to diminish those is going to be a really hard societal question.
I interpret that as we need to make some decisions to consciously move towards one direction versus the other.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right.
Okay. So I've just given you the microphone. You're on stage. You have 5 panelists and you get one question. You have one question. Your panelist that you're going to ask the question is Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Demis Hassabis, Dario Amodei, Sam Altman. They're on the panel. You have one question you ask to that group. What is the question that you ask?
I would ask them, why are you building this at all? What's the point? And that's not a preemptively skeptical question, which is you shouldn't be building it. They have the possibility of being able to respond well, that they do have a good answer, but I want them to be accountable to have to answer that question at a very serious level.
I love it wasn't like, how are you doing this? What are you doing this? When? It was why.
Yeah, it's always why. It's always why.
Samuel, when we first met, I told you something and I wasn't going to bring it up, but I have to because I think our listeners, those that are watching or listening in, might be thinking the same thing. But I thought about philosophers for a long time. And when I started thinking about the space of AI and humanity, and I started seeing the philosopher terminology come up a lot around ethics, responsibility, governance, I just always thought, and this is terrible, but I always thought that the philosopher was probably the most tormented soul out there. I went to art school, so I was kind of that thinking art student. But I remember thinking about philosophers 30 plus years ago that they were always the ones who were having a lot more questions and they were just tormented by it. And now I'm realizing, and this conversation I think is solidifying it, I find that because philosophers do ask questions and layer on more questions about the questions they're asking, I find that your area of expertise is probably less tormented. You're probably more grounded than a lot of us. I think a lot of us are feeling uneasy. We're feeling a little bit unsettled. We don't have grounding because we aren't asking the questions. I'm curious how you see that.
I mean, it's such a fascinating framing, and I need to think about it more deeply. I think there are lots of different ways people do philosophy. That's completely true. I think for me, though, it is the case that a huge amount of the discipline is in pressing right to the edge of the unknown or of the uncontrollable and recognizing how few things we're able to control, how little we actually understand or know, and then learning how to live in the face of that and be able to do that with a kind of force or resilience. And I guess in that sense, like I do think those are close to the skills that people are going to need to be able to deal with this next period well. Like whether this takes off and builds a very like unified culture or one that starts to fragment in various ways, what we are going to need is the capacity to see the deep purposes of life and to press toward them. And maybe it is the case. I think whether philosophers have all done, the classic joke is that ethics professors don't know how to be ethical themselves. Like there's this kind of, so the question about how to live is hard for everyone. I think that's absolutely the case. But the search for asking deep and foundational questions and facing the uncertainties at those levels, rather than being committed just to sort of superficial answers that feel comforting, I think that is actually a very important skill for this next period.
Thank you for that, Samuel. I'm asking one more question. And I don't know where you're going to go with this. So I'm super curious. What is essential to being human? And as we talk about AI, what do you fear most about what it means to be human as AI progresses?
Yeah, it's funny. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where someone asked something similar to that to me, and there are the like big like existential risk questions. Maybe this will create viruses that humans and other animals can't withstand. There are all kinds of like really big questions like that, and I think those are real, and we should be thinking about them carefully. I think that for me, though, the question you're asking is a more perceptive one, which is about what it means to be human. And I guess that my fear is not that AI will outcompete us or make it so that the deep purposes of human life are like somehow wiped out. It's that we will prematurely hand over our capacities or our deep reasons for existing to it without actually understanding what we're losing at that point. And so there are lots of examples of technological changes that have gone well. Plato famously critiques writing as something that's going to make it so that you lose the like deeper human oral culture, makes it so that memory doesn't work as well. That's a real question. And writing has had those effects. And it has also had many good effects to it. Like the ability, to read deeply is one of the most beautiful things that I've experienced in my life. And in my view, the thing that I'm afraid of is like what we think of as like de-skilling. So you go through school, you no longer write any paper specifically because like you can just circumvent that through artificial intelligence. It seems to me that figuring out how we build or form deep people is going to be the main thing that matters. That's not different than other ages, but it is going to be a new version of it for this next period.
Well, Samuel, thank you so much for the conversation. Not a light topic, not an easy topic. I do value you bringing it to a place where we can understand it and kind of make some sense of it. If people want to follow you, find you online, reach out. I know the Aspen, it's like, where do you ask people to go? How do they find you?
Yeah, great. No, that's really generous. This has been such a lovely conversation. And it means, honestly, like the thing that I really have valued about this is it is a kind of community. Like being able to talk about these things like with one another has been wonderful. And then in a way that other people are able to kind of listen and start to reflect for themselves, I think is really beautiful. So you can find me very easily if you type in Aspen Philosophy, you'll immediately see a whole bunch of things that we do. We publish a Substack called Wisdom of Crowds right now, and we're launching another one specifically about humanism and the future of society called Persona. That will be coming out in September. And then you can also find me on Twitter at SC Kimbriel.
Well, fantastic. And like I said, I do appreciate it. I do value it. I feel we could go a lot deeper on some of the topics, but thank you again. I do appreciate the time.
It's a real pleasure. The last thing I would say is rather than going to find me on social media, you should go read some good books. And the first one that you should read is a book by Plato called the Crito, where Socrates is deliberating. So one of his aristocratic friends breaks in to the jail cell where he's being held. And he says, look, Socrates, if people already know that we're friends, and if I don't do everything I can to get you out of here, then it's going to be a massive social shame for me. And Socrates flatly turns him down and decides to accept being executed by the state in that moment. And it's well worth going to read that book and try to understand what Socrates is doing. That book it's spelled Crito, Crito.
That's a gift. Watch this show, share it with others, and then go read that book. Well, thank you again for joining us on Disruptor Confessions. Those of you who tuned in, listened, watched, we always encourage you, please subscribe, share it with others if you've enjoyed this. Follow along on Substack, follow us on social and on your favorite podcast outlets as well as YouTube. Thanks again, Dr. Kimbriel. Appreciate it.